Hi, welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith. In this video, we're going to learn the 2 to 5 player game, Dungeon Saga by Mantic Games. If you're playing as the Necromancer, you'll be assembling an army in pursuit of a power so great, you'll be able to reshape reality itself. But if you're the heroes, you believe the Necromancer must be stopped at all costs. Whether playing a single adventure or an ongoing campaign of quests, before diving into the dungeon, join me at the table and let's learn how to play. It's hard to talk about this game without first discussing its rather unique box. From the outside, it looks like a regular box that you would store on your shelves, and you certainly can, but if you want, you can remove it from the slipcase, and then the box is shaped to look like a book, which you can store on your bookcase like so, and if you get the expansions, they'll store beside it like a series of books. And the box cover opens with a magnetized lid. But enough of the box, let's get inside and see how you set up the game. Dungeon Saga includes a quick start guide which helps players get set up quickly with a first quest that teaches the basics using a small selection of components. In fact, when you first open your copy of the game, if you want, there's a separate pack of cards that say open these first. Those are the ones relevant to this quick start quest. As well, the tiles that you need are bordered in red, so you can just punch those ones out first instead of punching out everything, and then get into the game that much quicker. That said, I'm going to be teaching you the full rules in this video, so let's dive right in. In the game, one player will be the Overlord, who will control all of the minions, and then up to 4 players should divide up the 4 heroes. So in a game with 3 players, one is the Overlord, and 2 of the players will control 2 heroes each. The only exception to this are the 2 beginner quests, which specify that you only use 2 heroes, as we'll see in just a moment. The Overlord will take the quest book and then choose an adventure for the group. And you can play any single adventure or start at the beginning and play through each sequentially, telling the overarching story of the included campaign. For this video, we're going to choose Adventure B, which is one of the 2 starter quests, but there are also 8 full quests included in this book. Only the Overlord should read the quest book, and they'll set up the map tiles that are shown with the adventure. But they should only set up those tiles that include the hero's starting area, which are these blue spaces, up to and including the first doors. This is just a small sample of the game's included 33 dungeon tiles, and these are double-sided with alternate art, allowing them to be used in future expansions or in your own player-created scenarios. You can also use the game's included plastic clips to hold the dungeon tiles together if you're concerned they might get bumped around during the gameplay. For this video, I've chosen one of the 2 starter adventures to set up. And once the Overlord has the initial floor pieces in place, they can check for other elements. The quest book includes a map key, and this explains each symbol an Overlord might find when setting up an adventure. For example, this quest shows 2 piles of bones tokens, which we'll place on the matching locations. These symbols represent a single locked door. So we'll put the door here on the indicated space, and we're told this is locked with a magical ward valued at 2. So we'll put a token there to remind us of that. The other miniatures, dungeon furniture, and tiles can be set nearby for use as needed, but there's so many included with the game, I'm actually going to store them off screen so I can dedicate the space I have here on this table to showing you examples of gameplay. The quest also details which heroes will be in play, and in the case of this beginner's adventure, only Madriga, the Elf Ranger, and Daenor, the Human Wizard, will be used. The players, or player, controlling these heroes should then collect the matching sheets. The Overlord should tell the heroes where to place their miniatures, which, for this adventure, is going to be these 2 spaces here. The game comes with various cards, which you sort by their backs into Overlord, item, spell, and ability decks. The quest tells us that the Elf Ranger will have 1 healing potion, and the Human Wizard will have 3 Power 1 energy crystals and the Flame Bolt, Break Ward, Burn, and Feat of Stone spells. The players would search the item and spell decks for the cards they need and place them face up next to their heroes. These decks can now all be set aside. For normal adventurers, you would shuffle all of the Overlord cards and then deal this number out as the Overlord's deck, returning the rest unseen to the box. For the 2 starter adventures, instead of randomly creating the Overlord deck, we're given specific cards to use. So I'll create a deck from these, shuffle them into our Overlord's deck, and return the rest to the box. The Overlord always starts with a hand of 3 cards, which are drawn now, and you keep these secret from the heroes. The commands per turn and raised dead limits shown with the adventure we'll learn about later. The game has tokens which can be sorted and placed nearby. For your first games, you'll just need wounds, piles of bones, mundane and magical wards, hero counters, and spell effect counters. The other ones are for more advanced quests or for campaign play. Each hero should collect and place by their hero sheet one of these hero counters. You'll want to place the range rulers and dice nearby as well. All players should take note of the characters, special abilities, their items, and spells, and then the Overlord can read out loud the story text and victory conditions for each side and any other special rules included with the quest. In this case, the heroes would be told they need to open the final door, which the Overlord would point out to them once they find it. We can see it's marked here with an X on the map. To win, the Overlord would need to cripple a hero, and we'll learn how that works a little bit later. And that's the setup. Dungeon Saga is played over a series of rounds until one side or the other achieves victory. A round begins with the hero's turns, where each hero will be activated once, in the order of the hero player's choosing. On hero's turn, it can move and then take an action in that specific order, or just take an action or pass and do nothing at all. The actions are to either fight, shoot, cast spells, or other actions that might be specified by the quest itself. Once during each adventure, a hero can use its entire turn to instead activate its heroic feat, as described on their hero card. Regardless of how you use a hero's turn, once it's been activated, flip the hero counter over to remind players that it cannot be activated again until the next round. Before moving on, there's a few general things we need to understand about figures and how you place them on dungeon spaces. First of all, a model must sit in a single space, clearly facing one of the four sides of its square. That direction is called its facing. We'll also refer to models being adjacent. A model in any of the 8 surrounding spaces of another model is considered adjacent to it. So these two figures are adjacent to each other, but they're both facing in opposite directions. The spaces surrounding a model are divided into a front arc and a rear arc. The adjacent spaces in a row directly behind a model are its rear arc, and all other spaces make up its front arc. There are also some larger models in the game, like this one, which have 12 adjacent surrounding spaces. Its rear arc is again all adjacent spaces in a row directly behind it, and the other adjacent spaces make up its front arc. Now let's learn about movement, and in these examples I'll focus on the heroes, and we'll learn about the Overlord's models a little bit later, but just know they follow the same rules of movement as the heroes do. First, a model can move a number of squares up to its movement value, which for heroes is shown on their sheet with this symbol. For example, Madrika can move up to 8 spaces. The information for all of the Overlord's minions are found on this one Necromancer Overlord panel, and we can see the movement information for each minion in this column. To help with the next examples, I'm going to move things around and add a couple of new objects to our dungeon. When you move a model, always move it one space at a time to show its full path, and ensure that you never enter a space with another figure, friendly or otherwise, or a piece of furniture. These are considered blocked spaces. Closed doors, like this one, and all of the empty space surrounding a dungeon is, of course, also considered blocked. That said, spaces with counters, like these piles of bones, can be entered, and you can even end your turn on top of them. Models can even move diagonally, unless the model could not move into at least one of the 2 squares on either side of that diagonal movement. Then it can't move in that direction. So here, our elf cannot move diagonally to this space, because the 2 spaces on either side are currently blocked. Now, if this figure was here instead, then it could move diagonally because this space was empty. Also, during movement, a model can freely change its facing. And a model's entire movement could be just changing its facing, but you cannot change the facing outside of movement. And if a model would ever move into the front arc of an enemy model, as our elf has done here with this skeleton warrior, it must stop and choose a final facing. So in this case, we'll turn to face the skeleton that has stopped us. Now, as a quick reminder, when a model is activated, it can first move and then take an action, or just take an action. The first action we'll learn is fighting. All models can fight, but Rordan the dwarf fighter is especially good at it, so I'm going to bring him out for this example. If a model begins its turn or moves so that an enemy is in its front arc, then it may choose as its action to fight that enemy. Now, only the model initiating the attack can do damage. The target is simply defending itself. So let's say our dwarf fighter is fighting this skeleton warrior. First, both players roll a number of dice equal to the model's combat dice value, which is shown here for heroes. And for the Overlord's minions, you'll look in this column down to the row of the model that is fighting. So in this case, the skeletal warrior will roll 2 dice and the dwarf will roll 4. Certain gameplay situations can modify combat dice values. For example, if a figure is in the front arc of more than one enemy figure, it will lose 1 from its combat dice value. This effect only occurs once, even if there are multiple enemies that you're in the front arc of. So our dwarf here will roll 3 dice instead of 4. This modifier also applies to the defender. In this situation, our skeletal warrior would also lose 1 from its combat dice value. A defender can lose another die from its combat dice value if the attacker is fully within its rear arc. So in this case, our skeletal warrior's combat dice value would be reduced by 1 because it's in the front arc of more than one enemy, and then reduced further by 1 because the attacker is completely within its rear arc. We say completely because it's possible for a large model to be both in the defender's rear arc and front arc at the same time. For example, if this zombie troll was attacking the dwarf fighter and it was placed in this position, then one space of its base is in the rear arc, but the other space here is in the front arc. So in this case, the dwarf fighter would not lose 1 from its combat dice value. For that modifier to apply, the zombie troll would have to be either here, here, or here. An attacking or defending model will also lose 1 from its combat value if it is injured, and we'll see how models get injured a little bit later. Regardless of modifiers, a model may never roll fewer than 2 dice. So going back to our original example where we had the dwarf fighter fighting the skeletal warrior, they are suffering no modifiers, so they will roll their full combat die values of 4 for the dwarf and 2 for the skeleton. And in this case, I've pre-rolled the dice. Now the attacker discards any feeble rolls. These are rolls less than or equal to the defender's armor value. You can find the armor value for a hero listed here, and for minions on the Overlord panel shown in this column. So our skeletal warrior has an armor value of 2, so any 2s or less rolled by the attacker, the dwarf in this case, are removed. These thrusts were too weak to damage the skeleton. No armor is perfect though. Regardless of what level the armor might be raised to, an attack roll of 6 is never discarded. And remember, only the attacker can do damage in a fight, so we don't check to see if the skeleton's rolls were feeble or not. Now that you understand how armor works, I can go back and explain one final rule related to combat dice modifiers. Remember I said your combat dice value can be lowered if you're in the front arc of multiple enemies, if you're being attacked completely from behind, or if you're injured. But you'll always roll at least 2 dice. So if you've been modified down to a combat value of 2, and there's still other modifiers you should have suffered, those then are subtracted from your armor down to a minimum of 1. As an example, let's say this skeletal warrior was being attacked from behind by this dwarf fighter, causing it to lose 1 combat die. And it's also in the front arc of more than one enemy model, so it would lose a 2nd die. Well, we can see its combat value starts at 2, so it can't be lowered any further. So instead, we would subtract that 2 from its armor. But at most, you can reduce armor down to 1. So we reduce it to 1 and ignore any other effects. Going back to our example, after removing feeble attack dice, if the attacker had no dice left, then the fight action would end. Otherwise, you now check to determine hits. First, arrange all of the attacker's dice from highest to lowest, like so. Then do the same for the defender, but line up the dice underneath of the attackers, starting on this edge and then going backwards. For each pairing where the attacker's value is higher than the defender's, a hit is scored. In this case, the defender's value is higher, but defenders don't score hits. They just stop hits from happening. So we could remove this one. In the case of a tie, the defender still blocks the hit. The attacker's value must be higher. If the defender doesn't have a die to match with an attacker's, then the attacker's die is considered a hit. So in this case, we have 2 hits. Now it's time to determine damage. When damaging a minion, count the total number of hits and then consult the Overlord's chart to see how that minion reacts. This skeletal warrior ignores single hits. No effect. The sword slipped through or bounced off hard bone. Score 2 hits and the magic holding the skeleton together is broken and the model is replaced with a pile of bones counter. Do at least 3 hits and the minion is smashed to dust and removed from the board. So in this case, our skeleton is reduced to a pile of bones. Let's say on a future turn, the Overlord was attacking with one of his minions and scored a total of 3 hits against Madriga. Regardless of how many successful hits are landed against a hero, they only suffer 1 wound. And when a wound is received by a hero, a damage token is placed on the furthest left available space of its wound track. As soon as all of the empty wound spaces show only red crystal hearts, the hero is said to be injured, which, as mentioned earlier, means they roll 1 less die in a fight. As soon as a hero takes a total of 5 damage, it is said to be crippled and cannot continue. Typically, heroes will lose an adventure if one of them becomes crippled. In some adventures, the Overlord has access to bosses who have sheets similar to a hero and take damage in the same way, including the fact that they become crippled when they take their 5th wound. Now that we understand the fight action, we can learn about freeze strikes. If a model starts its turn in the front arc of an enemy, just like our human wizard is here in the front arc of this skeletal warrior, then it can either stay in the same space and change its facing, or perform a breakaway. Breaking away is only possible if the first square a model would like to move to is not also in the front arc of another enemy model. So, for example, our hero could not be intending to move to this space because that's the front arc of this enemy model. If you can break away, you can still enter an enemy's front arc later in the movement, it just can't be the first space that you enter. Now, as soon as you would attempt to break away, all enemy models who have you in their front arc will get first a free strike. So if this model was actually here, and our figure wanted to break away by heading in this direction, then both of these models would get a free strike. And if more than one model is striking, then the controlling player of those models determines the order to resolve them in. If the model survives the strike, then it may move. A free strike is resolved just like a fight action, which we'll explain shortly, but just note they are not limited to once per turn. Your opponent might give you several chances to perform free strikes against them, and you can even perform a free strike with a model that has already activated this round. Free strikes can also be made against enemy models that enter the board in your front arc. Now, we'll see later how a skeleton can rise from a pile of bones, but should this happen in the front arc of an enemy, then the hero gets an immediate free strike against it. Now that we know about free strikes, let's go back and continue learning about the different actions. Instead of a fight action, you can take a shooting action if the model has shooting die values, which you'll see here on Heroes and here on the Overlord sheet. Our Elf Ranger has the shooting ability, and the steps to resolving shots are nearly identical to fights, except that the attacker and defender can't be adjacent. So the Elf Ranger would need to be back here, for example. Also, the attacker can't be in the adjacent front arc of an enemy model, even if they're targeting a different enemy. Madriga here couldn't target this enemy with a shot because it's too hard to aim with another enemy so close. Next, we check for range and line of sight. Models that can shoot will have a specified range. For example, Madriga has long range, so we would use the long range ruler. Range and line of sight is then checked using the straight edge of the range ruler. As long as the ruler can trace an unobstructed path through the front arc of the shooter's square to any part of the target square, the attacker can shoot. If the ruler cannot reach, or all measurable paths go through blocking elements, then a ranged attack cannot be chosen. Let's take a look at some blocking elements. For example, friendly models cannot be shot through. But in this case, we can still trace a line from this area of the ranger's square to this space of the skeleton square, and it doesn't cross over the square that our wizard is sitting on. Enemy models also block line of sight, so in this case, there are no paths that we can trace to our target model, and a ranged attack could not occur. Walls, doors, a space that's not part of the board, and the bookcase furniture are all items that can block line of sight. But do note, all other furniture except for bookcases can be shot through. So in this case, the ranger does have line of sight to the skeleton. Once you know you can shoot, you roll dice and resolve attacks just as with a regular fight action, except that the attacker uses their shooting dice value. So the Elf Ranger would roll 4 dice when making a ranged attack. When defending against a ranged attack, the model uses its normal combat dice value, even if it also has a shooting dice value. So a skeleton archer that's the target of a ranged attack would only roll 2 dice. If either model is injured, they roll 1 less die, and the defender also loses another die if any of the attacker's lines of sight go directly through their rear arc. Finally, although all furniture, except bookcases, don't block line of sight, the shooter rolls 1 less combat die if their line crosses any number of furniture models, unless they are directly adjacent to the furniture they're shooting through. And remember, a model always rolls at least 2 dice, and any other modifiers are then subtracted from the model's armor to a minimum of 1. Now, as before, each player rolls dice, the attacker removes any that are equal to or less than the defender's armor, and you compare the dice rolled from highest to lowest for each, removing any where the defenders are equal to or more than the attackers, counting up the final hits, and then determining any resulting damage. So we've covered fighting and shooting. Another action you can instead take is magic. Only spellcasters can use magic, and that ability will be listed separately on either their hero or boss sheet. Spell cards available to a character are listed with the adventure, which they will collect as we saw during the setup. The individual spells will have their own abilities and sometimes use associated tokens. We won't go over all the specific spells, but there are some key concepts that we need to understand. First, there are 2 types of spells, major and minor, as indicated here. As their action, a spellcaster can cast either 1 major spell or up to 2 different minor spells. When cast, a minor spell is rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise, while major spells are rotated 180 degrees. While rotated any amount, a spell cannot be used again. We'll see this later, but at the end of a round, all spells are then rotated 90 degrees clockwise. So minor spells can be used again in the next round, while major spells will still be unavailable. Like shooting, spells have ranges, which will be indicated as either long or short, using the long or short rulers. It may say adjacent, meaning the target must be adjacent, or it may say caster, meaning the target is the spellcaster itself. If the spell shows this symbol, then line of sight is also required. But if it shows this symbol, no line of sight is required. And when I say line of sight is not required, I mean that quite literally. This wizard here could cast a spell that does not require line of sight and target this enemy model through empty spaces, through other models, through furniture. It doesn't matter, but don't forget, it still needs to be within range. Not all spells are attacks, but ones that are will require the attacker and defender to roll dice just like fighting and shooting requires. The spell itself will tell you how many dice to roll, and the defender again rolls their combat dice value. However, magical attacks are never affected by any of the standard modifiers that we talked about earlier, like injuries or being in the front arc of multiple enemies. However, some items or game effects may specify that they affect magic rolls. And if a magic attack would target more than 1 model, roll the attack dice separately for each defender. If you're worried that initially it might be hard to remember the different rules for fighting, shooting, spellcasting, and the modifiers that are related to those, the back of the rulebook not only gives players a summary for the setup and stages of a round, but also summarizes the rules for movement and each type of main action, including any modifiers you should look out for. So this is something you might want to keep handy during your first games. Remember, once a hero has activated, flip its hero marker over, and once all of the heroes have activated, it's the Overlord's turn. But unlike heroes, the Overlord doesn't necessarily activate all of their models. Instead, the adventure specifies how many commands the Overlord receives per round. A command can be used to activate a minion, allowing it to move and then fight, shoot, or cast spells, just like heroes. And sometimes an adventure will give Overlord models other action options as well. No matter how many commands an Overlord has, each of their models can only be activated once during a round. Now that does not include free strikes or interrupts, which we'll learn about later. But instead of issuing a command to a model to move and attack with it, instead, a magic-using Overlord, like the Necromancer, has a special spell called Raise the Dead. When a command is used to raise the dead, the Overlord replaces a single Pile of Bones token with a miniature of their choice from the adventure list found here. This tells you which undead may be raised and how many of each type may be on the board at a time during the game. This means you can't use the Raise the Dead action if the maximum number of these minions are already in play. When a minion is raised, it is placed in a facing of the Overlord's choosing. And if it is raised in the front arc of one or more enemy models, then each of those models get a free strike in the order of the controlling player's choosing. Also, a minion that has been raised is counted as having taken its action that turn. So a minion like this just raised skeleton cannot be assigned another command to move or take an action during that Overlord's turn. Also, you cannot use the Raise the Dead action on a pile of bones that has another miniature standing on top of it. And if there happens to be more than one pile of bones token on top of each other, only the top one can be raised. As we referenced quickly before, along with regular minions, the Overlord may have access to bosses, which are basically heroes that work for the Overlord. They follow all of the same rules as heroes, have feats, and can sometimes use magic items. The Overlord also has access to cards. 3 are drawn from the Overlord deck during the setup, and more will be drawn later. But there's no limit to the number of cards an Overlord can have at one time, though they should be kept a secret until played. Once, during an Overlord's turn for the round, they may play a single card, either before or after acting with a model. And when the card is used, it is removed from the game. There are 4 main types of command cards. Extra commands, like these, which let the Overlord activate a varying number of additional models that turn. Double command cards allow the Overlord to double the normal number of commands they're allowed for that round. Now keep in mind, gaining extra commands doesn't allow you to activate a model more than once during the same Overlord turn. So any extra commands you gain that you can't use are simply lost. Raise Dead cards let the Overlord raise additional figures without having to use their regular commands to do it. But again, you have to respect certain limits. For example, you can't raise more dead than you have piles of bone tokens out, and you also must respect the limits as given by the adventure for how many different kinds of minions can be out on the board at one time. Any extra raises you played that you can't take advantage of are simply ignored. Finally, there are interrupt cards, and these are played by the Overlord between any 2 hero activations. This means they can't be played before the very first hero activates or after the very last hero activates during the hero turns. And these interrupts will allow the Overlord to activate the specified number of models shown on the card. Because these are played outside of the Overlord's turn, it means models that already took actions can be targeted again to take further actions, even multiple times with further interrupts. And they can still be activated during the Overlord's turn. Once the Overlord's turn is over, they draw a new card from their draw pile, and if the deck is empty, then a new card isn't drawn. The adventure victory conditions often indicate that this is the end of the game, and that means the heroes have a limited amount of time in which to complete their objectives. Finally, any spells that are not fully refreshed are then rotated a quarter turn, as previously explained. Then a new round is begun, starting with the hero turns. Now, one thing we haven't gone over are items. These can only be used by heroes or Overlord bosses and are granted for completing certain quests or when they're found while searching the dungeon depths. Their effects on gameplay is described on the cards themselves, so we won't go over each of them in detail. Most will have ongoing effects, but some will have this symbol, which means they can also be used outside of the hero's turn when the indicated effect is triggered. If an item shows the one-use keyword, then as soon as it is used, it should be removed from that adventure. Heroes or bosses can use an item at any time during their turn, and it does not count as their move or action. If an item shows this symbol, which represents paraphernalia, then any time a hero would move adjacent to another hero, they can freely give, receive, or swap eligible items if they agree to. Some magic items have symbols you won't find explained in this video or the rulebook, and that's because they're used as part of an Adventurer's Companion supplement available separately. We did discuss dungeon furniture, but doors and chests have additional rules. First, they may only be opened by heroes unless a special rule says otherwise, and they always start an adventure locked, with a counter next to them as shown in the quest book. Some locks, like these, are known as mundane locks. They must be smashed open by a hero using a fight action, treating the door like an enemy, with this number of combat dice and this armor value. If the hero lands a single hit, the lock is smashed. But a mundane lock may not be smashed by shooting it or using magical attacks. The other type of lock is a ward, which will look like this. These cannot be forced by strength. Instead, a spell must be used by one of the heroes to reduce the power of the ward. For example, this Break Ward spell can be used for that effect. Use tokens to show the reducing strength of the ward, and when it's reduced to 0, the lock is destroyed. When a door is unlocked, it's removed from the game, and if this reveals a new section of the dungeon, the Overlord will set it up at that moment up to the next locked doors shown on the map. If a treasure chest is unlocked, the hero who opened it takes any items inside as indicated by the quest book, placing them beside their hero. The chest stays in place, but the lid should be removed to show that it has been opened. Larger models also have some additional rules. First of all, they're not as agile. They can move forward or diagonally forward or straight back, but they can't move sideways or diagonally backwards. And to change their facing while moving, it will require a point of movement for each quarter turn. And you need to be sure that with each move, the model's base remains on squares permitted by the usual rules. So this zombie troll that has 4 points of movement cannot move directly to this space, because to do so, it would have to pass through spaces where it can't legally fit. Large models are also always counted as outnumbering single square models they are adjacent to, even if it is adjacent to several enemy models. That said, the large model itself is still considered outnumbered if it's within the front arc of more than one enemy. And finally, it should be noted that heroes have a legendary side, and certain later adventures will instruct you to use these more powerful versions of the heroes. If you're playing the quests as a campaign, you'll have to survive the earlier quests to get to these later ones where the heroes upgrade. And the Necromancer Overlord player, who controls the minions and bosses, can also come directly into play through their own figure, Mortibri, who also has a legendary side. But this won't be activated until a later expansion. And that's how you play Dungeon Saga. If you'd like to learn the rules to campaign play, I'll explain those in a short follow-up video that I'll put a link to in the description of this video. But if you have any questions about anything that you saw here, don't hesitate to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. But until the next episode, thanks for watching.